As you get on an airliner, you look at the cockpit wondering, how does somebody learn to read all that seemingly 500 plus dials in there? We're going to simplify everything for you on today's episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
Gopal, you just mentioned that you only need 3 or 4 instruments to fly an airplane, and we're talking about jets with the 500 dials that you see in the cockpit. What's up with that?
Yeah, it turns out that you only need a few instruments to actually fly an airplane. The rest of them are for other reasons: safety, navigation, the systems in the airplane, monitoring all those things. We're going to get into all of those.
And so, those basic bits of information that any pilot needs to fly just about any airplane just come down to a few things, like how fast you're going and how high you are. That's a good start, right?
And that's why pretty much every airplane you get into, from the most basic to the most modern, have a airspeed indicator some way so that you know how fast you're going through the air. We call it airspeed indicator.
And that is going to be usually right in front of you in the cockpit. And when you're learning to fly, that's one of the first things you learn how to use. And it's basically like a dial speedometer in the traditional sense.
Exactly. It's like a speedometer, except in this case, not how fast you're going on a road, but how fast you're going in air.
Okay, I can handle that. And the second crucial bit of information is how high off the ground are you when you're flying an airplane? So we call that an altimeter. I don't think there's anything like that in a car, right? So this is basically height above the ground, and it's also traditionally in a dial format, right?
Yeah, unless you have a flying car, I don't think you need to know altitude.
Those are
So
coming.
the car you're driving on a road, so that height, that other dimension doesn't even exist. Whereas in an airplane, you have to make sure that you're not running into a rock, you're not running into a mountain, you're not running into other airplanes. All those things matter.
And that sounds like that's just about all you need to fly an airplane, but maybe you want to know where you're pointed.
Again, in a car, when you're driving, there are road signs. You look at road signs, there's I-90, Route 41, whatever. In an airplane, when you're flying in the sky, we use at least a magnetic compass that says I'm flying north or south or east or southeast or whatever. And there are other variations of it, but some way for you to know what direction you're headed.
So the compass is required to be in all airplanes, and it's just a traditional magnetic compass, a little ball in a jar of kerosene that tells you, like you said, north, south, east, west, or in between. But most of us don't use that in everyday flying, but it's still required.
Yeah, it's required. And it's like literally carrying a compass around to find your way, unless you are in a forest trying to do pioneering and orienteering. There's really no reason for to use it, because there are other fancy instruments, which we'll talk about later, that really do that, what the compass does, and gives you much more information much more effectively.
Right. And then just so people know, if that compass were to break, I've had compasses actually leak and stop working, you still know where you are, because when you're out there flying around, you've got an idea of the geography, what direction you're headed in, but it's just something that gives you that supplemental information, especially if you're doing something like flying at night or flying in an unfamiliar area. But obviously the technology is advanced from there, and we'll talk about that. And if you're in a powered airplane, you've got a little bit of engine information, and that closes out the basics you need.
Yeah, exactly. If you fly a non-powered airplane or an aircraft like a glider, that's all you need. The first three things we mentioned is all you need: how fast you're going, how high you are, and what direction you're headed in. That's it. If you fly a powered airplane, and that could be single engine, like you and I fly, Elaine, all the time, or it could be 2 engines or 4 engines or any number of engines, you need to know what the motors are doing. You need to know the temperature and the oil pressure and all those things, all these technical things that you need to know. And that's honestly what complicates a display in a big Boeing or an Airbus compared to the small airplanes that we fly.
Yeah, the more systems and more gauges you're going to have, and I think we've all seen those when boarding an airliner. It's just amazing that the systems on those aircraft. And so if you get down to those 4 basics, and we have probably the most famous example in aviation is the 1940s era Piper Cub, which people still learn how to fly in because it essentially has those basic instruments, and that's all you need. And people wonder, well, why would you learn to fly that way? Well, it actually makes it really, really fun, really, really easy, because you can always build from there when you get into something bigger. And so those are still around.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing when people are fascinated towards driving a vintage car with minimalistic instrument, mechanical dials, right? With manual gear shift and everything else. If you go back to the 1950s cars, and that's what the fascination is. It's the exact same thing. There's something captivating about that primitive, basic, very primal way of learning to fly.
Definitely. And some would argue that that is probably the best way to start out because it's still looking out the window and knowing whether your wings are turning left, right, whether you're pointed up or down. By looking outside, that's the basic skill. And the instruments just help you make those more precise. But definitely that's going to be something you're going to find in any airplane. And you talked about aircraft without motors. So you can take out the engine instruments when you're flying your glider, right, Gopal?
Yeah, well, if you don't have engines, you don't need to monitor the engine. Therefore, you don't need that dial. So it could be as simple as maybe two, three dials, and that's all it is. When you fly a glider or even in an airplane, sometimes we need to know how fast we are climbing or descending. So we could add additional instrumentation like vertical speed indicator. In the glider, we call it variometer. So there are instruments that you can add. They give you supplemental auxiliary information that gives you a better situational awareness so that you can manage your flight better.
Yes, in the gliders, that's the variometer. You talked in other episodes about gliders seeking that lift in the air, and the variometer gives you a really good gauge of whether you're in descending or rising air. And so airplanes have something similar. It's not required, but a lot of them come with that because you'd like to know how fast you're climbing or descending in terms of feet per minute. And that's what the vertical speed indicator is. It's going to look a lot like the altimeter. And so when you're learning the basic flight instruments, that's probably the most common add on to the essentials.
Yeah, 100%. Especially when you're taking off or landing, you want to know how fast you're getting away from the ground or how quickly you're approaching the ground so that you can manage your landing properly or your takeoff properly.
Yeah, that's definitely something you can see without that instrument. But having that number and knowing that, okay, when I'm landing, maybe I don't want to go more than 600 feet per minute. That sure sounds like a lot, but that's actually a pretty normal descent when you're coming into land for an airplane. And without that, you wouldn't have the number. And so it makes it a little safer when you have those instruments.
Yeah, see, as we talk to the rest of the instrumentation, once you get to this instrumentation, it's really hard to imagine how to go back. It's kind of like us thinking about how did somebody go somewhere without a GPS, or how did we ever find an information without Google way back when? Yeah, all those things, once you get used to the technology, it's kind of hard to go back. But the foundation is this: if you're flying any kind of aircraft, you need to know how fast you're going, you need to know how high you are, you need to know what direction you're headed to, and if you have an engine or engines, you need to know how well they're doing. That's it. That's your basic fundamental information you need.
That covers the basics, and those same instruments have gotten a little better lately. So we'll talk about retrofits next.
I think a term that a lot of people may have heard is six pack. Now, I'm assuming in the case of aviation, when you say six pack, you don't mean six pack of beer, right?
Six pack of soda actually is what you're thinking of when you're
Ah, okay. All
flying,
right. That explains it.
right? Actually, six pack is an informal piece of jargon that's really common in aviation, and it's the most fun because then you can make your jokes about the soda and the beer. But the six pack actually refers to the very traditional flight instrument panel that most of us learned to fly in if you did learn to fly in the last 10 to 20 years. And you can still learn to fly that way. It's just that the technology in newer airplanes has gotten quite different where it no longer looks like a six pack. So when you talk to other pilots about the six pack, you are definitely putting a picture in their mind of, okay, the six round dials that most of us learn to fly in. You talked about the basics, the airspeed, altimeter, that's all included in that.
Yeah, so we have the airspeed, we have the altimeter, we have the directional indicator. So instead of the compass, in addition to the compass, we have some other heading indicator We call it sometimes directional gyro. That's there. And then there are a couple of other instruments in the six pack, like attitude indicator, not like, oh my goodness, I'm really bad. Not that attitude, but the attitude as in whether the aircraft is level or climbing, and then how fast it's turning. So a few other things that we add. That's those six instruments are very basic. Anybody who learned to fly in a traditional aircraft in a traditional instrumentation are totally used to that.
Yeah, well, I have a really great picture of a perfect six pack with a couple other instruments. It's called an 8-pack that you find in most of the common training airplanes out there. And so, in addition to those basics, there's something called a turn and bank indicator, and it's a round dial, the exact same size as all the others, that gives you a little bit more information on how much you are banking a wing on the airplane. So, the six pack is something so many pilots are familiar with. And that's considered by now kind of the old style panel, even though you see a lot of those. If you had a deluxe six pack, which is the 8-pack, you have a couple of navigational instruments, same size round dial on the side of it. And so the 8-pack is considered, oh, okay, the deluxe version of the six pack.
Got it. Now, just because your airplane originally came with this six pack or this deluxe six pack doesn't mean you're stuck to it. You can actually upgrade it, probably even more than you could do to a standard car.
Yeah, that's the hottest business in aviation right now. I think on the personal general aviation level is upgrading your six-pack airplane, because a lot of us are flying around in traditional aircraft that are very well built, are very well maintained. But these old instruments, sometimes they either do break down over time, or you just want something more reliable. So you can retrofit, paying a specialized shop called an Avionics shop to do things like, okay, I want a digital version, a computer driven version, very reliable type of technology to make that six pack either an electronic screen version, same round dials. I recently did that to my airplane where I replaced a couple of the dials with digital dials so that it's a little bit more reliable. And by the way, it incorporates GPS, which I love.
The digital dial takes the place of the traditional non-digital dial, the analog mechanical dial, if you will, but can be lighter, can be more reliable, like you said. It may even take up less space, may take up less electricity or battery or whatever energy you're using to power it. And in many cases, it's easier to read because you can make them bright, you can make it less bright. It's not that different than modern day car cockpit compared to older cars from like 1960s.
Yeah, it's really neat when you can do this, because I have an 8-pack panel that still has the same look and shape, except with those digital round dials now that replaced, at this point, it's the attitude and the directional gyro. It is now almost like a little computer screen where you can have multiple pages on it. You can make it bright or dim depending on the amount of daylight you see out there, and lots of other features that you wouldn't find in just that old mechanical. So same look, new technology. And that's a step that a lot of airplanes are taking, in that they have this mixed look.
Yeah, so if you buy a car, and if you think of owning a car, typically the car lasts maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever. Like in the airplane, the airplanes can very easily, the airframe of the aircraft can last 50, 60, 70 years very, very well. And they are perfectly legal, perfectly airworthy. There's nothing wrong with them if you maintain it properly. Therefore, you want to keep upgrading the avionics. So you may be flying an old aircraft, but with modern day avionics.
Yes, and because this technology has been so much more available just in the last 10 years, you're seeing a lot of these airplanes that people are flying around. Well, we're not going to get rid of them by any means. They're, like you mentioned, they're perfectly good airplanes, but we can upgrade those into computer driven avionics. And that is literally all the rage right now.
Yeah, and I think not everybody does it, but some people, especially car nerds, can go and buy this retro aftermarket parts and replace their gauges, like the speedometer, instead of their traditional speedometer. Maybe they can put a digital speedometer. So it's a very simple thing. It's just less common in a car because, like I said, the car's life cycle is much, much less.
Yeah, it's much the same way. In some aircraft, let's say you build an aircraft yourself, you can actually upgrade your own instruments that way, or change them out. If you're flying what most of us are flying around, a certified aircraft like Pipers and Cessnas and a lot of other makes and models, You do have to have a certified shop put those in, but again, it's very common to upgrade at least a couple of the instruments, and then you can pick from there. Okay, next year I want to put in the rest of the instruments, or next year I'd like to put in a full digital panel. And we'll talk about that next because that is becoming much, much more common these days.
Yeah, so one last note is that when I owned my glider, it came with a mechanical variometer. We talked about variometer before. It came with a mechanical one. I was able to buy a digital version of it, take out this box, and most of them have standard holes with standard screw sockets. So you take them out, you change the electronics and the plumbing in the back, and you put a new digital system, and voila, you suddenly have a almost like a brand new airplane.
Wow, that is really neat. There are some of those really simple change outs that you can do for an instrument like that. And that is going on all over the place because gliders and airplanes are seem to be kind of a mix of those older mechanical instruments and the new ones, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and like you said, you can replace one to one a digital version to an analog version. But what happens if you can redesign the entire cockpit? We'll talk about that in the next segment.
So the larger aircraft, and especially airliners and things in the jet category, tend to have that new technology a lot sooner than the small aircraft. So when we're seeing those airliners, there are big screens that look like iPads on there. What's that about?
Yeah, it looks more like an iPad and like computer screen, like you mentioned, than a traditional dial. We call them in general glass panel, right? It's not because it's made of glass, but that's the terminology we use. It's basically a redesigned version of a cockpit. Instead of looking at dials to relay the equipment, to relay the instrumentation in a much more intuitive, easy to understand, easy to follow way.
And that is still going to have those basic instruments that we have to have, right? Like airspeed and altimeter, right?
Of course they do, but they don't need to be showing it in the same way as before, nor in the same place. When you're looking at it, you have a certain field of view, if you will. So by putting things in there in a most easy readable way, maybe you can become a better pilot because you have that information popping out at you when you need it.
And you can also have large numbers showing up for things that are really important, like airspeed and your altitude. And so those instruments are not going to look at all like the six pack. They're actually airspeed tapes, which follow that airline style airspeed indicator that you'll see, where you actually just see numbers and colors presented. And the altimeter works the same way, right?
Yeah, that's a good point because when you go to glass panel, we talked about six packs, but not all the six instruments need to be at the same size. So they can make one bigger, take out a bigger view, and highlight things. They can use colors. In the traditional instruments, there's much less colors. Here, they can use colors. They can use backlighting. They can use pop-up messages. They can use flashing lights. It's kind of like, think about it this way. Let's say you have a fuel dial, and if you don't look at the fuel dial, you don't know if you're running out of fuel. But what if it comes and chimes at you? What if it says empty fuel, or you're getting to empty, you only have 5 miles to go? That gets your attention. That's the exact same thing with a glass panel.
Okay, so when you're driving a car, everybody has those tools. How many miles can you go on this tank of gas? And that's a really, really neat safety tool that almost all airplanes have if you upgrade something in your engine system, that it will literally tell you how much time you have left in fuel or how many gallons you have left. Because as we all know, with traditional fuel gauges in a lot of airplanes, and I think some of the old jetliners were this way, the gauges were a little hard to read. You couldn't tell, okay, do I have 50 gallons left or 70 gallons left? And this actually gives you a number, and that's a really cool thing that has actually enhanced safety from what I understand.
Not only it gives you a number, it makes sure it gets your attention, it chimes at you, it flashes at you. And many of these modern avionics can even go change the fuel tanks or do other things to help safely fly the aircraft. Elaine, I think maybe an analogy would be a Tesla car compared to a traditional car, right?
Sure, those are state of the art for sure.
Yeah, not only state of the art, but if you look at it, If you go into a modern Tesla car, there's a computer, not your traditional dials. That is the equivalent of glass panel. So if, for people who drive a Tesla, they know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and even most of the newer cars of any model are going to have a computer screen, usually right in the middle, that can give you a lot of information, including navigation and the traffic out there, obstacles, things like that. So the fact that that has become more common in airplanes just shows that that computer-driven technology is really the way to go.
Yeah, so the moving map that takes up a lot of the visual real estate, if you will. Traffic. In the case of driving, you're showing, if somebody is coming in across traffic, etc. But in an airplane, you have to worry about three-dimensional traffic. You have to worry about terrain. You have to worry about towers and everything else. And the new cockpit design changes the way how that information is presented. This is why, Elaine, going back to our start of the episode, even though there are 500 dials, there are only few of them that give you the most critical information. Everything is for situational awareness and managing the aircraft.
Yeah, what's really cool for those learning to fly today is that you will probably get to learn in a newer glass panel, and you will still start with those basics: the airspeed, the altimeter, where you're pointed, and then you add all the features from there. Because, like you mentioned, there's the glass panel, and a lot of those glass panels mean you have two computer screens in very common aircraft. That is going to be even more common. And think of all the information you can put in there, including turning on things like synthetic vision so you can fly around at night and really see where you are. You mentioned traffic in a three-dimensional form. That is getting so much more sophisticated because once you have two computer screens and computers behind the cockpit deriving that information, think about how easy software upgrades are going to be. And when that happens, airplanes have even more features when that comes out. It's just amazing that starting with that kind of hardware, it can open up all the future technology that is going to be coming down.
Yeah, for sure. I think anybody who's like, again, a Tesla owner or an EV owner or modern cars know that they can upgrade your software even when you're driving sometimes. Like a Tesla with a full scale driving, it literally can drive itself. Let's say like automation. But I do think that there is a downside to it because all these things look like a video game. And it is easy to get complacent because you think the computer is managing everything, but you still need the human element. We have talked about in a previous episode where the human element and not getting distracted, focusing on the right thing is important. Unfortunate side effect of the technology is it makes it maybe a little too video gamey.
And pretty distracting because, and you and I have seen this with people, especially those transitioning into these more sophisticated glass cockpits, is that it's very distracting to see all the information on one screen, and you have to have a little bit of that extra training to train your brain so that the human being flying the airplane can still stick to those essentials. Again, how fast you're going and how high you are still the keys to flying around safely. And so that is really something that has even changed flight training.
Yeah, I think that the transition, we have to think about it in two ways. People who train in sort of the quote primitive instruments coming onto these modern day glass panels, they have a transition to go through because where's the information? How do I find it? How do I change it? But the people who are training in this modern day sometimes have difficulty going back to sort of aircraft that do not have it. It's kind of like, let's say you drive a Tesla, but you go rent a car that's more traditional dials, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, how do I do that? Right? So I think the transition is difficult on both sides.
Yes, we call it six pack to glass and glass to six pack. It's amazing that you do have to also retrain your brain even to go to simpler instruments just because they look and behave so differently. So, what's really cool about this is you can have the best of both worlds if you want it.
Yeah, and then, most of our training starts in a single engine and then progresses to multi-engine. So let's call it simple to complex. So by learning it in the simple system and adding on to the complexity, this is why a Boeing 777 on an Airbus 380 captain is able to look at all these 500 instruments and know what he or she needs to focus on at any given time and get the information instead of getting distracted. and, disoriented with that.
And it's amazing what you can think about coming down the line. Did I mention that a lot of these glass panels are even touchscreen? So from small personal aircraft to big jets, sometimes you can have that option. And there's a big debate among pilots about what's better, moving dials and a hard keyboard or touchscreen keyboards. I mean, a lot of these operate a lot like your phone. It's just really amazing.
Yeah, like an iPhone or an iPad kind of a thing. Yeah, maybe next generation is mind controlled avionics.
That'll require some new hardware upgrades, I assume.
You need the Vulcan technology.
We're getting there. Have you ever seen a 6-pack panel in an airplane, or have you gone all glass? Let us know your stories in the comments.
This is